Hi, this is Tom from Nightingale Games, and we'll be talking about some advanced rules and miscellaneous features of War Room. Please check out the basics video and the combat video before watching this one, unless you already know everything, in which case, let's continue. So, let's talk about some world map features. I wanted to mention some impassable areas. The Sahara has 3 impassable zones. Planes can fly over, but land units may not enter nor pass through. There's also the Himalayas, which is impassable by land. There are some corners on the map, which I wanted to make sure to explain. There's only one or a few. For example, B-28 units cannot pass through to P5, and likewise U-3 cannot go to P4. You cannot pass a corner point. And there are islands, but everything within this circle is considered land. So you don't travel from here to the water to the land. You just travel to the land. Each region has an ID. If it doesn't have an ID, then it's not a place you can be. There are 6 narrow sea passages in the world map. The Straits of Malacca, there's the Suez Canal, the Dardanelles, the Gibraltar, entrance to the Black Sea, and the Panama Canal. You must control the territory. For example, you must control Egypt or be friendly with whoever controls Egypt before you can pass through. Same goes for these, except these have a little red dot on one side. So whoever controls Gibraltar may enter and exit the Mediterranean. Whereas over here, I don't know if you can see it, but you must control both sides in order to pass through. If only one side is controlled, neither may pass through. And finally, I wanted to mention these mobilization icons in China. And this is a special feature exclusive to China, where they can produce infantry units only in any of these territories with this icon up to the strategic value number. So here they can produce 2 infantry during phase 7. So they mobilize immediately rather than having to wait like all other nations for the next round, phase 5 refit deploy. They can mobilize immediately. And they are also in these initially Japanese-controlled territories as well. Next up, I want to point out the neutrals. There are 19 neutrals prefixed with N, and if you invade them, you immediately gain a stress. And the opposition side, so if the Axis invaded, the neutrals would immediately align with the opposite side. So if the Axis invaded, the Allied forces would align with them. And the nearest land command of those allied with the neutral would put a flag down and take control, put commands on any surviving units. So, for example, if the Germans invaded Turkey here, hotspot would be placed, and these forces would rise up to defend Turkey, and that's printed on the board. If Germany won, you would just go ahead and place a German national flag down, if all of these units were defeated, or even if just the land units were defeated, these air units would be taken over by some Russians, and they would have to land in a friendly zone. You do not gain a medal, so there's not much benefit to invading it other than convenience and passage. Also, trading rights. So you'll notice that some of the neutrals have these circles here. For example, Arabia has oil, Spain has OSRs, and Sweden has iron. There's some others over in South America. And during the Phase 7 production, Each nation may make one trade. Trading is not allowed among allies or even amongst enemies. They may make one trade according to the chart that's on the inside cover of your OMP chart. So for example, you give up 2 oil and get back 5 OSR or 3 iron. Now, some nations, some neutral territories start the game pro-allied, and these are tinted light green and have a little blue border to their ID box. And the Axis may not trade with those nations unless it invades and takes over. So that covers some of the neutral elements. If the Allied forces enter, the standing army will not rise up. So the game doesn't begin with any pro-Axis nations, only standard and pro-Allied forces. You'll notice that some of these only have infantry, so you could theoretically come in with some air and obliterate them first, but you would gain a stress. Next up, we'll be talking about strategic bombing and convoys. Raids occur after the air battle, but before the land battle. And this pertains particularly to strategic bombing. So let's say, for example, the Germans are flying into India here. They have a bomber with them. If they survive the air battle, bomber rolls 4 dice, like so, and according to the color that's rolled, they may eliminate either a resource or a unit under production of their choice. So they decide after they roll. You roll for each bomber 1 at a time, so you have to roll each set of 4 once. So for example, in this case, these units are under production. He rolled a yellow. He could either take out one of the industries or eliminate the submarine. And normally an armor would take 2 or 3 hits, but in this case, a single green hit would eliminate this unit under production. And these would go directly to the casualty list. Another thing is if you rolled a black, that would be wild, so it could be either any resource or any unit. But also, you could bomb the industry directly, in which case you would put down one of these bomb tokens. And there are 3 things that happen when a territory is bombed. Its port advantage is lost, and its rail usage is lost, and also its infrastructure is damaged. So one of these smokestacks, for each bomb token present in an industry site, it may manufacture 1 less. So for example, India has 5 currently. Now with this bomb token, it can only produce and deploy 4 new units in a given round. And eventually it could be reduced to 0 such that there's no industry at all. Now, so multiple bomb tokens can accumulate in a territory, but it's only relevant if it has an industry. For other regions, this does nothing because there's no rail and no port, but here it would just simply block the rail, and here it would disable the port advantage. So that's strategic bombing. Now let's talk a little bit about convoy raids. Convoy raids happen either at coastal convoy raids or transocean convoys. These are all in the Atlantic. There's 3 bubbles here, and there are 2 territories that are linked. This is supposed to simulate some of the Lend-Lease where goods are being transported across the Atlantic. Let's say the Germans want to raid India here with a submarine. Let's give them some more. Let's give them 2 submarines and 2 cruisers. They roll 1 die for each unit present. Air units can also perform a convoy. And if enemies were present, air or sea, they would not be able to raid the convoy. They would have to have a battle instead. And even if they won, they would still not be able to raid afterwards. If there were enemy troop transports present, they would not prevent a raid. They would just be eliminated. So you count up all of the units present, 1 die per unit. Let's just say there's 4 ships there. They roll 1 die for each once. And if you roll the color of the resource, in this case you're only looking for yellow, then the linked territory, whoever controls that, must tick down on their resource chart that particular resource. So these convoys are merely a liability for whomever controls the territory. And they refresh each round. So if this stayed here for the following round, it could raid it again. Whites are considered misses in raids, and for strategic bombing, whites are hits for the infrastructure, but they are not wild for units or resources. If each command may only target 1 bubble. So you can see in this case there are several bubbles. If you came with just 1 command, you would have to pick one or the other bubble to target. There's a few other locations, for example here, there's 2 bubbles here. If you had multiple commands in the region, for example, if you had air and sea, one might target this one over here, and the ships target this one here. And if there are allies present, then they all roll together at once with a commander, similar to battles. So now let's talk about some miscellaneous features as far as the resolution of hotspots. Besides battles, anywhere where there's an enemy units, there are some overlooked places where you need to place a hotspot. For example, you'll need to place a hotspot in a garrison. So even though there are no units, British units present in Iran, if Germany invades, they'll still need to roll against a garrison. That's explained in the combat video. And of course, you'll need to place a hotspot for any convoys. Those will need to be resolved. And there could even be, if Germans were already here and these new units were placed during the deploy phase, but not given orders to move, there could still be, because there are enemies present together in the same territory, a hotspot would be placed. And then finally, if there were any embattled territories from the previous round, those would need to be flipped to the hotspot side and addressed once each round. Now, the timing of choosing which hotspot generally doesn't matter, but in some minor cases it does. For example, if Germany was about to take control of India with its land forces, it might want to do that after it performs a convoy raid, so that the British Commonwealth will lose their resources and the territory. Whereas if they attacked and claimed India first, then there would be moot. You would not want to raid your own convoy. So timing matters a little bit in that case, which emphasizes the importance of turn order. There's another very minor case involving port advantage, where if the land territory is taken, then your port advantage wouldn't apply for the sea battle. So those are some little tidbits. One other little minor note is that if you have air in a region, the submarines, since they can't shoot up at the air, they do not protect any troop transports in that region. So if the Soviets had some planes here, the planes could take out these troop transports, and they would not be protected by this submarine. And one other note for the combat, eliminated units. If there are multiple allies in a battle, it's best to transfer those eliminated units immediately to the morale board so they don't get mixed up. So now let's talk about captured units. If these units were under construction in India, then and Germany moved in and captured India, then it would claim these units and be able to deploy them in the refit and deploy phase, which would be a great loss to the British Commonwealth. Air, if there were only these Russian air units defending India, they would not be able to hold it if Germans had ground forces. Only ground forces, land forces, can capture a territory. So air units may not do that by themselves. So these would have to fly and land in a friendly zone. As far as who controls a territory after a victory, some of these have rules as far as whom they reverts control to. So if, say, the U.S. liberated a Russian territory from Japan, the control would revert back to the Soviets. The U.S. would not be able to control Khabarovsky here if they claimed it on behalf of the Russians. Now, if it was an enemy territory to begin the game with, for example, if Great Britain and the U.S. liberated France, Great Britain was the commander and it took control, it would not be able to transfer control later on to the U.S. Transfers are not allowed. And some of these territories, you'll notice, have an outline. The Ukraine and Belarus have a special outline. This means that if the British recapture those, control must revert to the Soviets. There's also some over here in Asia where if the US or anybody liberates Manchuria from the Japanese, then control reverts to China. You'll notice that China does not have control of its capital at the beginning of the game, and it's the only factory that would enable it to manufacture artillery. As it cannot use oil, that's the only other unit besides infantry it can manufacture. There's a note about the gray zone here. If all of the units desert with your stress points, then the end enemies are present. For example, if Germany was here and the British had to give up their last remaining unit in Iran, Germany would not immediately claim Iran. They would have to wait till the following round and probably battle a garrison force in order to claim it. Plus, they couldn't claim it with air unit anyway. They would have to have a land unit present, as mentioned. The Soviet-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact is a pact between Japan and the Soviet Union where they will not attack each other. If they do, they will gain, either side, whoever breaks the pact, will gain 6 stress immediately, and they do not gain any medals that particular round. Now, if Japan also invaded Britain, they would gain the medals for that. But if in the round that they broke the pact, Japanese claimed some of these Soviet territories, they would gain no medals. Soviets would still suffer the stress. And they would still claim, the Japanese would still claim ownership and take the card and everything else, but they just don't gain the medals. Units may not even fly over the enemy territories, and it affects allies. So if the Americans could not even launch an attack from Khabarovsky to Japan without breaking the pact, and they may not even attack without the Russians' permission. So an ally may not intentionally break the pact without the approval of the Russians, or the Germans could not break the pact without the Japanese approval. There are some extremely rare third-party situations where if China is here, Japan enters, and the Soviets enter, then there's a situation where the Chinese may battle the Japanese while the Soviets sit out, since they don't want to break the pact. And if the Japanese happen to take control, then the Soviets would have to leave the following round to avoid breaking the pact. That's a number of rapid-fire miscellaneous rules that we've gone over. If you have any questions, we'll probably end up having an FAQ on our website, nightingalegames.com. And you can always ping me directly if you have any rules questions. And thanks for watching.